All right. So this lesson is called the health benefits of natural sunlight and the theory of it. So let's dive into this. And I'm going to start with the definition of a solar callus because the question is for most people who've never heard the term is what is a solar callus? And this is my definition of a solar callus, which is a tan that is developed by gradual progressive exposure to full spectrum natural sunlight that allows one to harness the health benefits of the sun by tolerating increasing doses of sunlight without burning. Now, this definition is one that I've come up with myself, but the idea of a solar callus is not new. And through history, there have been periods where, from a medical point of view, the development of a solar callus has been a treatment modality for various illnesses. The most extensively researched or extensively implemented implementation of solar callus was in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and it was used by various doctors in Europe, Switzerland particularly, and the United States for extrapulmonary tuberculosis. So tuberculosis that affected the joints, that affected the skin, um, responds unbelievably well to heliotherapy or direct deliberate sun exposure. And the alternatives to at the time when heliotherapy was being implemented in Europe by a gentleman named Auguste Rollier. He was a pioneer. The alternative was surgery, and this was a potentially disfiguring process that had quite suboptimal outcomes in compared to heliotherapy. So, not only that was in a specific clinical indication, but rickets. So, rickets is a severe manifestation of vitamin D deficiency. It is the bone or skeletal implementation or outcome of severe vitamin D deficiency, and it was a pandemic. It was an epidemic levels in the Industrial Revolution in cities like London, in cities like Warsaw, and the development or the recognition of light and its role in health has essentially largely came out of understanding or researching and noting interesting observations like poor kids in the rural areas didn't get rickets and didn't have these bowed legs, whereas the children living inside cities were, almost universally afflicted. And there was a range of very interesting experiments done that displayed the effect of the sun, particularly UV light, on the synthesis of vitamin D, and experiments where they essentially exposed one arm, one wrist to vitamin D, to UV light, and noticed that the bone changes or the bone density, and resolution or improvement of rickets was noted in the other non-exposed wrists. So there's a range of interesting experiments to show that there was the discovery that there were these health effects of sunlight. So I won't go into the the whole skin cancer and the evidence behind deliberate sun exposure, because that is another whole 50-minute lesson in itself, which is the increasing amount of clinical evidence that those people who get more sunlight have lower all-cause mortality, which in medical speak means that the death rate is lower. And there was a pivotal study done published in 2016 by a Swedish group who followed 25,000 Swedish women over 25 years. And they basically asked them questions about their sun-seeking behavior. Do you sunbathe during summer? Do you sunbathe during winter? Do you ever travel overseas to sunbathe? And do you use tanning beds? And the title of this study was the melanoma in southern Sweden cohort. So they were expecting to note increased death for these sun-seeking women, but they found the exact opposite. And this is a finding that was shown before this study was done, and it has been shown again after, more recently with Richard Weller's UK Biobank analysis. So with that background, I'm really going to talk to you about the more theoretical benefits of getting sunlight. Yeah. So let's think about this. So really, we can think about them as requirements. They're not only benefits; they're actually requirements for health. So I'm going to give you an overview, but really, we've got different ways of thinking about how the sun is affecting our health. So circadian rhythms and circadian signaling. The idea of a circadian rhythm is this biological reality that humans, just like all organisms, even as primitive as eukaryotic and organisms, have a 24-hour clock timing mechanism. The reason why we have that and what it does is it essentially allows us to program our biological activities to the changing nature of light and day. So as the Earth orbits the sun, there's different amount of energy in the environment, and essentially the environment is changing radically. So the circadian rhythm is a roughly 24-hour endogenous or internal rhythm that allows us to not only secrete the right hormones at the right time, but also to anticipate changes in the environment. And that circadian rhythm is key. It's what it helps us release all our hormones at the right times, like melatonin and cortisol. It allows us to time our digestion and our metabolism. It allows us to remain sleepful and wakeful at the right time. So it is absolutely critical. And the reason I've used a yin and yang symbol is because optimal circadian rhythm and signaling requires this duality of bright light during the day and complete darkness at night. So obviously sunlight is half of that, and when that process gets disrupted, then we're gonna get very sick. And I say that we can't out eat a bad light diet. That is something that I believe to be true. So that is why carnivore will get you a lot of the way, and for some people most of the way. But if you disrespect your light environment, then you're potentially going to get quite sick. So what else? There's quantum biological processes occurring in our cells and our body, and sunlight and the light from the sun is absolutely essential in this. So hormonal regulation, vitamin D is it's not actually, well, it's a vitamin, but it's actually a hormone, and the role of UVB light in synthesizing vitamin D in the skin is key, but also these light signals that get received by the eye and then transmitted via the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland to orchestrate the hypothalamic pituitary axis, gonadal axis, reproductive, which is the reproductive axis, your adrenal axis, so your stress response, thyroid axis, all these major functions from a hormonal point of view. So organ specific functioning, so things like and I've put the heart and the brain here, is because these are the most mitochondrially dense tissues in the body, and sunlight and light wavelengths, particularly in the longer wavelengths, so red and infrared, are critical to optimal mitochondrial function. And you might have heard of Dr. Chafee talking about mitochondria in the context of cancer, and his interviews with Professor Thomas Seyfried. And yes, what we're eating is affecting our mitochondrial function definitely. But what is less recognized and equally important is that these electron transport chain proteins in the mitochondria are essentially receivers of light and UV light, but mostly red and infrared light. And what I've got here is the final point is that infrared light and the production of melatonin is happening in our mitochondria, and the infrared light that we're getting on planet Earth is actually half of the photons that are hitting Earth. Yet no one realizes that this is like this is an essential light nutrient that not many people are getting. So I've given you a brief overview of circadian rhythms. Like I said, it's a 24-hour rhythm, and approximately 70% of our genome is under circadian control. So that just gives you an idea of how critical this is for our body's functions. And we receive these light signals in many ways, but the non-visual photoreceptor system is essentially these proteins that allow us to detect different light wavelengths without necessarily forming images, and that's key. So what happens if this process gets disrupted? Well, if you get artificial light at night, if you have insufficient full spectrum daylight, and that's in terms of both brightness and in the correct wavelengths, and also if you're doing jet lag, or if you're having jet lag, doing shift work, social jet lag, which is partying at the club till 2 a.m., sleep disturbance, and just general modern life, and where everyone has these energy saving LED bulbs in their houses that are profoundly disruptive to our circadian rhythm. And when we lack these sunlight signals, we get molecular chaos, because circadian rhythms are being programmed at the cellular level. These are how fundamental and they are, and that's going to affect mitochondrial function and metabolism quite significantly. This is a bit of an overview of the process of circadian reception, but it's essentially light hitting the eye and then being transmitted through the retinohypothalamic tracts to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is a master clock. And Simon mentioned that I'm a fan of seafood. This pathway, between the eyes and the hypothalamus, is the most enriched in DHA, the polyunsaturated omega-3 fatty acid, in the brain in humans. That means that seafood, I believe, is critical in optimal, obviously, brain health, but also optimal health. So I hope you're including that as part of your carnivore diet. So what happens when how else is circadian rhythms touching our health? And that is metabolism. And what this means is all the tissues that are conducting metabolic processes in the body. So your pancreas, your liver, your gut, your adipose tissue, and your muscle, they all have clocks. They all have circadian clocks. Function is influenced by time of day and by light signals. So, and I won't go into it in this lecture, but essentially you can cause obesity, metabolic disease, insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes by having profound circadian disruption. And you can raise your blood glucose irrespective of what you're eating, based on your light environment and based on a blue light environment. So the skin can see light, and it does that because it expresses these non-visual photoreceptors. And it, just like your eyes, is helping to collect the time of day information through its non-visual photoreceptors to convey this time of day information to your cells. So the 2017 Nobel Prize in Medicine was won for the discoveries of molecular mechanisms controlling the circadian rhythm. So again, there's been some questionable Nobel Prizes in history, but so you can take this with a grain of salt. But to suffice to say, it is a significant part of physiology. So what else? So these quantum biological processes, this is running on this presupposition or reality that what is happening in the human body is so much deeper than simple biochemistry, and we're really running this electromagnetic vehicle, and sunlight is providing the photons that are interacting with electrons in the photoelectric effect, which is one of Einstein's suppositions. And what this does is this allows this biological semiconduction to occur, and the transmission of light signals from the sun is helping us run processes and run cellular processes in the body. So I'm not going to go in depth in this, but there's a very important compound called pro-opioid melanocortin, and that links this significantly links the sunlight to quantum biology. So hormonal regulation, like I mentioned, amongst these pathways are the leptin-melanocortin pathway. And again, this is related to that POMC master pro peptide hormone that I mentioned. The key point to know is that the signals that regulate body composition, so if you're in this group because you're looking to lose weight or you're trying to change your body composition, those are fundamentally shaped by light. So if you're trying to lose weight without recognition of your light environment and and the light signals you're sending yourself, then you're making it harder than it needs to be, or you're possibly having to remain strict carnivore longer than you would otherwise if you got in full spectrum sunlight. Vitamin D synthesis. So people would know that have heard about vitamin D. So maybe you take vitamin D supplements. Vitamin D is synthesized when you get this UVB light, which is between 290 and 350 nanometers. Um, the importance of vitamin D can't be overstated because you have these vitamin D receptors all through your body. And really, the cutoffs are in Australia and everywhere for what is termed as sufficiency of vitamin D, or in Australia, we use nanomoles per liter. It's simply not enough. And really, the evidence shows that when we get that number over 100, that is when the risk of a range of cancers, cardiovascular diseases, metabolic diseases, autoimmune diseases start just disappear. Well, when that number is over 100, and you can't get those same effects by simply supplementing your way there. Melatonin. Now, some people take melatonin to help them sleep, and yes, melatonin is a circadian hormone, but it is also made inside your mitochondria, and it is on stimulation by an infrared light during the day. What that means is you have a profound need to be outside and to generate melatonin, which is having this antioxidant effect in your body and in your cells. So being indoors, being inside in an office under artificial light and not outside, even in a car, because the windows that we have built our environment with block a significant amount, or if not all, infrared light. And you might notice my room is red because I've got a device here that is putting the longer wavelengths, it's putting deep red and infrared back, and some of the near infrared wavelengths back into this room. So infrared is key. It's a light nutrient that no one is getting. No one knows that they need. And your brain has evolved these amazing functions to essentially concentrate near infrared light photons into the most sensitive parts of your body, whether that's the gray matter of your brain through your cerebrospinal fluid. It's also concentrated to the fetus in a pregnant woman by the amniotic fluid. So to be outside is to get enough sufficient infrared light. As I said, and that's simply a summary of what I've just mentioned. And that is your mitochondria. And why are you making melatonin? Well, because it's an antioxidant, and the electron transport chain, which is taking the fats that you're eating on the carnivore diet to make energy, to make ATP. Well, it is that process of electron transport and oxidative phosphorylation generates reactive oxygen species, and these are a problem. They're necessary in a small amount because they have cell signaling mechanisms or roles, but in excess and at the wrong time, they damage the electron transport chain. They damage the mitochondrial DNA. And what Dr. Thomas Seyfried and Dr. Chafee have talked about is that cancer develops as a mitochondrial problem. And it's not only cancer, but in fact, all chronic diseases and monochronic diseases are fundamentally problems of mitochondrial dysfunction and excess reactive oxygen species, and therefore the damaging of the mitochondrial DNA, which exists as these ring-like structures throughout the mitochondria. That will accelerate the process of mitochondrial dysfunction because your mitochondria, the colony of mitochondria, become essentially heteroplasmic, which means that they accumulate these mutations, and then their ability to produce the structural components of the mitochondria start breaking down, and then you get failure of energy production. And just like a brownout, anyone who's traveled through the developing world has experienced a brownout, and that is when the electrical load on the grid exceeds the capacity of the electrical grid and the lights dim. That is essentially what happens when you have mitochondrial failure. And you can get there a lot of ways. You can you can eat this high deuterium, seed oil rich processed food, standard Australian and American diet. That'll get you there. But fundamentally, if you deprive yourself of infrared light, if you deprive yourself of correct circadian signaling, you're going to get yourself there even quicker because your mitochondria are going to suffer and they're going to accumulate these mutations, and your health is going to manifest either as type 2 diabetes, as dementia, Alzheimer's dementia, as heart failure, as chronic kidney disease, or as acute age-related macular degeneration, all these diseases of the most mitochondrial dense tissue organs in our body. So that is about basically a summary of why you need sun and the role of sun in optimal health. Um, a couple quick points about those organ functions is that your cardiovascular system relies on UV light for nitric oxide production. It does so because UVA liberates this really strong blood vessel relaxing, essentially signaling gas from its stores in near the skin and around the blood vessels. So if you have high blood pressure, if you have hypertension, and that speaks to me that you have you have a UVA light deficiency, because those blood vessels are simply just not relaxed, and living indoors without getting full spectrum sunlight, you are not going to get UVA, and therefore you're not going to be producing enough nitric oxide. Infrared, again, we've talked about its role in making melatonin. In the recent Regenerate Summit in Melbourne, my talk was titled "What Your Cardiologist Doesn't Know About Sunlight and Heart Health," and I actually presented compelling evidence from Gerald Pollack and his lab, who's a world-renowned water researcher, showing that it's actually infrared light, this non-visible infrared light, that actually changes the phase of water inside the vascular system, called fourth phase or structured water, and that is driving blood flow. So simply being outdoors and being in natural sunlight is essentially taking pressure off your heart in terms of allowing the heart to pump. So the brain, it relies on this infrared light, as I mentioned, as an antioxidant through melatonin. It relies on UV light to stimulate the production of a specific type of melanin. So you might know about melanin in the skin, but you also have melanin in the brain. And when someone gets Parkinson's disease, they lose their ability they lose these special neurons in the brain, called the dopaminergic neurons. But essentially, this is in part and increasingly being recognized as simple a lack of stimulation on the production of neuromelanin, which is so important, and a range of other functions. So if we link this to circadian disruption, and or vitamin D deficiency, we can see at how many different diseases this lack of sunlight or inappropriate artificial light environment is linked to. So aging, which is the most fundamental mitochondrial problem, cancers of the breast and prostate, these hormone sensitive cancers are unequivocally linked to artificial light at night. And if anyone's interested in preventing breast or prostate cancer, maybe you've got a family history of breast cancer or prostate cancer, listen to my recent episode with Dr. Martin Moore-Eid, because we go into how our light environment is accelerating and driving these cancers. So neurodevelopmental disorders like autism and behavioral problems, there's strong evidence that the light environment and the circadian functions, and the fact that kids are being put in under these artificial environments is a part of this. Eye disorders, so myopia, 100% a disorder of indoor light and indoor environment, particularly bad in East Asia, where these habits are even more exacerbated. Autoimmune disease, if you look at the development of autoimmune disease by latitude, it just increases in a dose-dependent manner with distance from the equator. So the less solar yield, less sunlight you're getting, the higher risk of developing autoimmune diseases. And the obvious corollary is, or implication, or causative role of because you're simply not getting enough UVB to generate sufficient vitamin D. And I didn't mention specifically, but your immune cells have vitamin D receptors in them. Your ability to fight off viruses, fight off tuberculosis, and also your ability to not recognize your own tissues as foreign, i.e., develop autoimmunity, is a function of how much sunlight you can get, and that process breaks down with there's insufficient sunlight. So the cardiovascular disease, Richard Weller's team, who I mentioned, he's a world-leading dermatologist who's looking at the systemic effect of sunlight on health. And, he has shown, and through his work, the critical role of sunlight deficiency in high blood pressure. There's a very established link to development of heart attack and circadian time of day, but also season. Psychiatric disorders. Michael Moore-Eid in his interview that I did recently with him quoted a paper where they looked at a psychiatric treatment facility or a psychiatric inpatient unit, and it was a square, and it had it had sunlight facing rooms, and it had rooms that faced the sunrise and rooms that didn't face the sunrise. They noticed they did an observational study and noticed that the rooms that faced the sunrise had a half the inpatient time required. Same treating clinicians, same medications, same spectrum of clinical presentations, but you got discharged. You were twice as likely to be discharged. Your likelihood to be discharged, you were twice as early if you were facing the morning sun. So that illustrates the critical role of circadian rhythms in psychiatric health. I've talked about immunity, and COVID-19 was a massive illustrator of the susceptibility to this disease based on latitude. And there's some very elegant analyses in the US that showed the further south you are, the less likely you are to be hospitalized and die of COVID-19. And that's because the UV light yield was higher, and the sunlight, there was greater ability to generate vitamin D. So I mentioned Parkinson's and neurodegenerative diseases, talked briefly about obesity and diabetes, but it really is a sunlight deficiency. So that is a summary of what you can potentially fix or improve or accelerate your journey towards based on your relationship with light. And really, on a most fundamental level, all life on Earth is tied to sunlight, and the process of photosynthesis is taking sunlight energy, it's taking photons, and it is taking carbon dioxide and water, and it is producing a carbohydrate backbone compound, and it's producing oxygen. What your mitochondria are doing is essentially reversing that process, and they're taking oxygen and a carbon backbone structure, either fat or carbohydrate, and they're essentially burning them in this furnace, which is your mitochondria, which is running at extremely hot temperatures and producing both chemical energy, water, infrared light, UV light, a range of other things. But to think that we are somehow disconnected from this process of sunlight and light energy is incredibly hubristic, and it's simply wrong. We are fundamentally tied to the light dark cycles, and let me make the point. That all food is simply sunlight. And what I mean by that is photosynthesis is even the steak that you're about to eat. That is a product of photosynthesis, because the animal has consumed grass that has grown under the influence of light. And really what food is, it's a barcode of sunlight energy based on that area that you live in. So why is it so important to eat locally and eat food that's grown near you? Is because the food is conveying an information, and it's conveying information through the electrons in that food, and your mitochondria are essentially checking that and receiving that information. You're either contributing to molecular chaos or order by eating a diet that's congruent with your latitude and your season. So photosynthesis is the spider on the mirror. Oxidative phosphorylation in mitochondria is the spider inside the mirror imaging photosynthesis, and that is Dr. Jack Kruse. And if anyone's interested, I would highly recommend listening to my Dr. Jack Kruse series on the Regenerative Health Podcast. There's 3 episodes. They're each 2.5 hours each. So there's a lot of content there. So let's bring this back to what I said at the beginning, which is the advice that you're getting regarding the sun. It remains fundamentally ignorant of these biological realities and the importance of deliberate sun exposure. And when you're told to avoid the sun based on this increased risk of melanoma, and the smaller risk of photoaging, well, relative as it's portrayed. It's really what it is it's conveying a fundamental ignorance or misunderstanding that there's all these other benefits occurring, whether that's UVA light and the cardiovascular benefit of full spectrum sunlight, the infrared light and effects on mitochondrial melatonin production, the fact that we know that there's less all-cause mortality the more UV light you get, melanin and those quantum biological processes, circadian rhythm and circadian entrainment, the whole non-visual photoreceptor system. It's so in depth, and when you get advice to avoid the sun, it's really missing all these fundamental and very important functions. So I mean, I call it a myopia of centralized medicine. This is an allegory or a story of parable from East Asia. It's a very old both Hindu and Buddhist story, and the story is that an elephant walks into town, and there are these six blind men, and they can't see anything. They don't know what an elephant is, and each of them they go up to the elephant, and each of them are feeling a different part of the body. So there's this gentleman on the left is feeling the ear, and he's saying, look, this is a palm. This is like a palm tree. There's a guy feeling the trunk. He's like, I think this is a vine or a something like that. The guy feels the tusk, and he thinks that it's a spear. Another guy feels the leg, and he thinks that it's a tree trunk. And the bloke at the back is feeling the tail, and he thinks it's a snake. So the point is that a lot of the messaging that we're getting regarding the sun is by subspecialists are just like these blind men feeling the elephant, because they're not seeing the whole picture that I've just briefly laid out for you. And what I've briefly laid out for you is by no means even getting close to touching the surface of the number of ways that the sun is required and important for health. But the same person that is calling the sun or holding the tail and calling it the snake, they're not able to explain a fraction of what I've just explained to you. So that needs to be really considered by anyone who is telling us to avoid such a critical part of life and health. So if you want to learn more, then might be subjects. So you can go and find out about infrared light, how it's affecting melatonin, how it's affecting all kinds of important health outcomes. So those are just some of the podcasts that I recommend listening to.
Awesome, Max. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
Um,
I'll also make the point. I don't know if this is the end of my presentation, but if anyone wants to take the Solar Callus course, this is one of I think there's about 15 lessons now. It's over 10 hours of content. If you want to learn exactly what else to do, or why else this is important, and how to get sunlight safely, then that course has everything that you need. Thanks, Simon.
awesome. Thanks, Max.